I want to thank, of course, Steamboat Institute and Jennifer and everyone who played such a critical role in allowing me to come here. I don't know, is Kristen Oren here? Can you stand up? This is Kristen Oren, who's the editor on my blog, Race Ipsa, which could not exist without her. I was extremely uncomfortable at dinner with Jennifer when all of a sudden she started to praise Kristen and say how extraordinary she is. And I had to spend the rest of the evening saying that she really is a terrible writer, knows no grammar. She's part of a 12-step program where I just brought her in just to try to make sure that she wasn't taken from us. I've been assured by her husband that he will beat down anyone that even says hello to Kristen. So stay away from that woman. No, she has transformed the blog. I am known for typos. I blog at 5 in the morning, and Kristen finally reached out and said, for the love of God, you need an editor. And so the blog has been greatly improved with her. I want to try to cover as much as we can the time that we have. As you know, we have about 30 minutes to talk about free speech. And so, as Henry VIII told Anne Boleyn, fear not, I will not keep you long. So let's get at it and try to put this in perspective. Much of our discussion today is going to come out of the book that I just produced called The Indispensable Right, Free Speech in an Age of Rage. You'll notice it doesn't say the age of rage because it isn't our first. This book attempts to talk about free speech through the stories of the periods and personalities that influenced our understanding of free speech. It's an unvarnished history. We're often a bit worse than our advertising when it comes to free speech. We have gone through periods of rage in which rage rhetoric, as I've called it, leads to state rage, where the government steps in to censor, blacklist, even arrest those with opposing views. We are living in that type of period now. And rage is an odd thing. It is liberating. It is a sense of righteousness that is at the farthest end of reason. But the thing about rage that people refuse to admit is that they like it. You know, when I was doing the Trump trial in Manhattan and I came out and I watched people dancing in the street after the conviction, it was the face of rage. It's addictive, and it's contagious, and people like it. Because it allows them to say and do things they would not ordinarily be able to say or do. And so the reason it is so contagious is that we live in times of great fear and anger. And during those times, free speech is almost always the first casualty. In fact, in 1800, and this confirms my students always joke that I cannot speak for 5 minutes without mentioning James Madison. But in 1800, James Madison wrote an incredible paper on free speech and the prosecution of opposing thoughts. And he referred to sedition prosecutions as the monster that lives within us. And that monster dwells in every body politic, and it comes forth when we are very afraid or we're very angry. Madison wanted to slay that monster. He thought that perhaps he had. The fact is that the First Amendment was the most revolutionary part of the American Revolution. It still is. There's a movement to amend the First Amendment. One of my colleagues is leading that movement. She insists that the First Amendment is, quote, aggressively individualistic, and we need to change the language to allow for free speech to be limited by standards like equity. And this is a popular view. In academia, I'm now something of a dinosaur. I'm often called a free speech absolutist. There was a time when that was a compliment. But it's true. I don't like many limitations on free speech. I do believe that the solution to bad speech is good speech. But most importantly, and this is what I talk about in the book, going through history to the present day, a censorship system hasn't worked once in the history of mankind. Not once. There has never been a censorship system that has succeeded. And so the question is why? And I'm going to be talking about that in a second. But it is not the message that has been conveyed to students across our country. We are raising a generation of speech phobics, kids that have been taught since high school that speech is triggering, it's harmful, it's a threat to them. You just had an article in the Washington Post saying the First Amendment is out of control. It's said in the article that it's endangering your very livelihood. That's no accident to see this pattern of publications. When my book came out, 4 anti-free speech books came out by law professors, including one at Michigan that said that free speech is the Achilles heel of the United States. The question is what we can do about it. What future do we have? It's a dangerous conceit, and I hope that's not what you will get from my book, that just because we have come through all of the prior ages of rage, that we'll come through this one. This one's different. This is the most dangerous anti-free speech period, in my view, in the history of this country. So let's get to Louis Brandeis and the title of this book. Now, Brandeis was one of the great civil libertarians with Oliver Wendell Holmes. They often dissented. They were called the Great Dissenters. They saw a horizon that most couldn't see of individual rights. The title of this book comes from one of his cases where he talks about free speech being an indispensable right. My editors were not really thrilled with that title, by the way. It was a bit long, hard to say. But I insisted on it because it captured what the book tries to say. You see, that wonderful expression that it is an indispensable right occurred in the Whitney case when Brandeis signed off on imprisoning a woman for speaking against lynching. And Holmes joined him. The point of the title is meant to be ironic, but also a caution. We all agree free speech is indispensable. We just can't agree why. And the question is, why can a great civil libertarian like Louis Brandeis refer to this as the indispensable right and then send Charlotte Anita Whitney to jail for speaking against lynchings? So we get back to the truly revolutionary part of the Constitution. It was revolutionary because no country on earth had ever stated what is in the First Amendment. To this day, it's unique. Even when France, with the help of Lafayette, wrote of their rights of man, they came close to the First Amendment, but then added a comma. After we said that you cannot abridge free expression, we put a period. They put a comma. And after that comma, it said, so long as you comply with the laws of the nation. What our First Amendment said was that it cannot be abridged. And it was based, I'm hitting the wrong darn button. It was based on natural law. That's what was so revolutionary about it. This was the product of the Enlightenment. It came out of John Locke. The framers believed that free speech was a natural right, a right given to every human being from God, not from the government. It was a right that existed in the state of nature. It was a right that we left the state of nature to protect. It wasn't discretionary. Now, that view of free speech as a natural or human right still is revolutionary in every possible way. But we lost that moment of clarity within a few years. Under the Adams administration, they used the Alien and Sedition Acts to prosecute his opponents. And we abandoned the Lockean view of natural rights. In my view, that is what led us to what I call the functionalist approach to free speech. The idea that we protect free speech because it has this function. It's good for democracy, and it certainly is that and much more. But that's not the whole of it. We need free speech to be fully human. You see, if you say that you protect speech because it's good for democracy, it means that some speech may be viewed as not so good for democracy. It means that you have high-value speech and low-value speech. It means that you can have trade-offs. And that is the slippery slope upon which we have been on for over 200 years. So what is free speech? You know, many of you have seen this in person. One of the most famous pictures in the world, entitled God Creates Adam. And you know, thousands of academics have focused on the touch. What does it mean? Many people believe that, well, that's the gift of life. God touching Adam, giving Adam life. In my class, I just went through this lecture yesterday, I tell my students I'm not so convinced. I have a sort of weird Lockean view of what Michelangelo was trying to do with that touch. Maybe what he meant is that what was passing to Adam was not life, but a type of divinity. You know, a while ago, a wonderful medical expert, when he was visiting the Vatican, noticed a strange thing about the central panel. That the area around the image of God was the perfect rendition of the human brain. And I mean perfect. It was exactly the human brain. Now, it's a rather odd coincidence. It's hard to imagine that you would come up with that rather irregular shape that just happened to be the human brain. Now, with Michelangelo, one can easily come up with an explanation. He would dissect corpses to look at the human body, the muscles, the bones, that helped him become a great artist. So if that's true, why would Michelangelo put God superimposed over the human brain? In my view, it's because he's talking about something divine in being human. That the divinity that was passed was the act of creation. That human beings became creators. That's what distinguishes human beings from other species. That divinity is within each of us, in the human brain. That the greatest gift of God is the right to create. And what the book talks about is how we are hardwired for free speech. Parts of the human brain actually shrink if you don't use them. The hippocampus will actually shrink within studies of prisoners in segregation, explorers cut off from other human beings. They found that parts of the brain were reduced. We have a need to project ourselves in the world around us. It's irresistible. It's the very image of a starving artist, which is a true image. There are artists who would starve themselves in order to buy canvas. Artists like Van Gogh. They would rather create than eat. Why? Why is it that we are so hardwired? The fact is that we have seen studies about the DNA of human beings. It's a curious thing. You know, we share human being DNA with other animals. A great ape has 98.7 of our DNA. We have a 60% overlap, or 61% overlap with a fruit fly. We have a 60% overlap with a banana. So does that make us talking bananas? I mean, does that mean that we're just hairy talking bananas? And the answer is no, because we have a divine touch, a need to project part of our views, our values, ourselves in the world around us. We learned that from the most curious ways. Some of you may, way back when, have read the story of Phineas Gage, who was a foreman on a railroad, a construction company, and he was responsible for blowing away rock. And to do that, you would drill a hole in the rock, you'd fill it with explosives, and then he would use his tamping iron, that exact tamping iron, to pound the explosives down, and then he would get at some distance and they would set it off. The problem is, on this one occasion, he used that tamping iron and it sparked. And he had made the perfect cannon, and it blew that rod, right through his head. I got this picture from Harvard Medical School, which was wonderful. Although they were really disappointed. They said, we have a much better shot of the entry and exit wound. And I said, I think we'll go without that. But what was interesting is that the doctor didn't particularly rush to go see Phineas Gage because he had a rod blown through his head. So he considered this just to identify the body. He was shocked when he showed up. Phineas Gage was sitting on a porch talking. A rod just blew through the frontal cortex of his brain, and he seemed to be able to talk just fine. And what the doctor concluded, which may be the single most brilliant on-the-spot diagnosis, is that we never knew what the frontal lobe did, what the cortex did. But this doctor realized we now can find out because he doesn't have one. So if we look at how he's different without it, maybe we can figure out what it does. And we now know that all the things that make us human are really sort of gobbled together in that frontal lobe. Things that make us love others, love God, love society. And Gage changed. He was described by his colleagues as becoming almost animal-like. He was violent. He couldn't make relationships work. He had a hard time expressing feelings. He regressed. And that brings us back to Charlotte Anita Whitney. Was a remarkably brave person. She was one of the first American communists. She went to Wellesley. She was comes from a really wealthy family. Her family traced their lineage back to 4 families on the Mayflower. I don't know how you do that, but it does show an element of inbreeding. But she was also the niece of Justice Field, one of the longest-standing justices on the Supreme Court. She would spend every summer with him. But when she was at Wellesley, they went on a field trip to New York to look at a settlement house. And she was shocked. It was supposed to be just a day trip. She stayed 4 months. Now, I disagree with the conclusion she reached. She ultimately became a communist. But I don't disagree with her motivations. She saw poverty and she wanted to get rid of it. She saw suffering and she wanted to end it. It was a cruel time. And it radicalized her. The interesting thing, though, is that some of the views that she was viewed as a radical then are not viewed radical now. She fought for women's rights. she fought against lynching. And when the day came for her speech, the police showed up and said, if you give one more of your inflammatory speeches, we will arrest you on the spot. And to make sure she understood that, a cop stood right behind her. And to her credit, this privileged person of the best schools went ahead and gave her speech against lynching and didn't change a word. And she was arrested on the spot. And it went to the Supreme Court, and to the shock of many of us, Louis Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes said, this is an indispensable right, but clearly found that it was dispensable in this regard because they didn't see the function of protecting it when people were giving inflammatory speeches. Charlotte Nina Whitney is one of the people that are highlighted in this book that meet the definition of George Bernard Shaw. In fact, many of you meet that definition. And I'm sad for you. And I'm proud of you. You see, George Bernard Shaw said that unreasonable people expect the world to conform to them. So he said, all history is made by unreasonable people. You look to me like incredibly unreasonable people. And this book is about people like you. People like Whitney, communists, fascists, feminists, libertarians, unionists. They all had one thing in common. They wouldn't shut up. No matter what people said, you could have a cop right behind you, they would not shut up. They were brilliantly unreasonable. Our history has been made by unreasonable people. The U.S. Revolution was unreasonable. That is unreasonable. According to virtually everyone who lived at the time, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Period. No comma. It is a language that Hugo Black once said, I read no law abridging to mean no law abridging. So the question is, why is that language, which is the art of clarity, the very embodiment of clarity, so difficult for the Supreme Court to understand and interpret? And partially it's because of that monster that lives within us. It's a monster that devoured John Adams, who arrested his opponent, seeking on death sentences for criticizing him. Jefferson ultimately pardoned them, but Jefferson himself fell victim to that monster. When he was president, fewer, but a couple of people were still charged with sedition. Now, I want to go to art. The book talks about this painting, which I love. I love Rockwell. I like abstract art as well, but I really like Rockwell. And when FDR gave his For Freedom speech, Rockwell was inspired during World War II, decided to paint the Four Freedoms, but it was the freedom of speech that he painted first, and it was that painting that became the painting for war bonds in World War II. And it wasn't a picture that he made up. It was a picture of his neighbor, who was a dairy farmer named Jim Egerton. He was actually the great-grandson of a Revolutionary War hero. And he came to this meeting in Vermont, and they were building a new school, which was remarkably popular, and he was the only one to stand up and say that he was opposed to it because we couldn't pay for it. And he said, I don't have the money. I've had a bad year. Where's the money going to come from? I can't pay any more taxes. And Rockwell was so taken by that moment as quintessentially American, he painted it. Now, what's interesting about the reaction to this and other paintings, I talk about in the book, because Rockwell was attacked by sophisticates and art critics. The most vehement was Clement Greenberg, who was the person who discovered Jackson Pollock, who made Jackson Pollock, and some people felt started the abstract art movement in the United States. And Greenberg attacked Rockwell viciously and said that Rockwell had chosen not to be taken seriously and that his was not art, it was kitsch. He's the most popular artist of his time. He said it's not art. Rockwell responded in what is the most elegant response in history to a critic. He painted The Connoisseur. Now, The Connoisseur is an amazingly piece of work. It's huge. And in the background is an abstract painting. And then in the foreground, you have the back of obviously a sophisticated person who's trying to look for meaning in this painting. And it was his response to his critics. And one of the people that went to see its unveiling was William de Kooning, an abstract artist. And he was floored. And he exclaimed, "It's better than Pollock." And he had one of the reporters give him a magnifying glass to look at the abstract art and said, "That's one of the finest abstract pieces of our generation." Rockwell was showing, I could do that. He went to the finest art schools. But instead, he wanted to paint something that spoke to the essence of who we were. It wasn't simplistic. It was profound. That's the reason when it comes to constitutional law, I'm unapologetically Rockwellian. And when you look at the First Amendment, you have the same connoisseurs who are telling people it's not that simple, those words. It has to be translated by connoisseurs like myself. And those connoisseurs control much in higher education. So the question is that the end of it? The answer is no. Now, you're probably asking, what is the end? I would say, buy the damn book. Oh, no. That's not true. No. It's just that I'm in a hard thing. I was recently, a woman came up to me. I know I'm running a little over time, and they're about to get the hook, but a woman came up to me recently at a speech, and she said, "I read your book. Is there any way you could give me a sense of optimism? Can you end on an optimistic note?" And the thing is, there is an optimism there, but I'm not too sure if it's what she was looking for. Because if you believe that human beings are hardwired for free speech, if you believe it's in our DNA, then you can't really kill it without killing us. You see, if it's part of being human, all of your efforts can reduce perhaps our appetite for free speech, but you can never extinguish the taste for it because it's a gift. It's part of being human. But I'm in a position, Woody Allen was asked the same question, and he said, "Look, I'm sorry if I can't give you something more positive, but you take 2 negative points and make it a positive." And so I'll give you 2 negative points, and we'll hopefully make a positive. The first negative point is this is an age of rage. We have seen an alliance we've never seen before. Corporations, media, the academia, government are aligned in this anti-free speech movement. There's a roaring anti-free movement in Europe that has left free speech in a free fall. That wave has hit our shores. And this movement that began in higher education is metastasized in our politics and our media. But here's the second point. It can't work. It hasn't worked. Every one of those periods in my book ended not because of Congress and not because of the courts. They've never been friends of free speech. It's ended because the public said no. They saw McCarthy for the first time on television. They said no. In 1800 is the only presidential election where free speech was the critical issue. Thomas Jefferson ran against John Adams on free speech, and he won. I wrote a column to those challenging Joe Biden, now Harris. They should do the same. let's have another election on free speech. The Biden-Harris administration is the most hostile to free speech since John Adams. Let them own that. Let's have a vote on free speech. Because I have faith in the American people. I've seen it over and over again in history. So this is an age of rage, but it's not our first. But we really haven't changed because we can't. Because free speech is what defines us. It's not the rage that defines us. It's free speech. Thank you very much. Sorry, I went over. Do you want me over here, or? Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Turley. We like to have some time for audience Q&A, if you don't mind. We've got some excellent questions from the audience. I wanted to start with a question about something you just said about the Biden-Harris administration being the most hostile to free speech. Can you give some examples or kind of share how that is the case?
Yeah, there's no question about it. Joe Biden is the most hostile president in history since Adams of free speech. He's gone on and defended censorship. He told companies that didn't censor, quote, "You're killing people." His government has a system of censorship that is unprecedented. One federal court called it Orwellian. For years I testified about that censorship system, and Democrats would always go after me and say, "You've no proof that the government is coordinating or supporting censorship." And then Elon Musk bought Twitter and released the Twitter files. And I testified right after that release. And suddenly the Democrats weren't denying it anymore. They just said, well, we have to censor. And one, Representative Dan Goldman from New York, said, "Professor, this is like crying fire in a crowded theater. That's what we have to censor." And I said, "Congressman, you do realize, right, where that line comes from? That's from Schenck. That was Oliver Wendell Holmes, all right. But it's from Schenck. It was a case in which Holmes upheld the conviction of a socialist for opposing the draft by passing around a flyer quoting the United States Constitution. Is that the case that you want to rely on? Is that the standard? Everything's now a fire? Everything is now a crowded theater?" And he cut me off and he said, "I don't need a law lecture." And I said, "I think you do." But, they have created the most massive censorship system in our history. And I think we're up to this task, but I must tell you, it is so far more sophisticated than anything I've seen in history. They're going after the revenue of sites, they're going through blacklisting, ratings, rankings, throttling. It is an unbelievable system, and it is working. And that's one of the reasons in the book I propose a number of suggestions, and one is one that I have no idea why Trump doesn't make part of his campaign. I've suggested that the government pass a simple law that gets the United States out of the censorship business and says that no federal funds can be used to support by grant or any other means the targeting, censorship, or ranking of sites based on their content. And we can get the United States out of the censorship business once and for all.
Can you talk a little bit about the COVID pandemic and how it affected this issue? Was it most effective at waking Americans up to how information is censored, or was it more effective at empowering censors?
Oh, it definitely, COVID came at a time when this movement in higher education was taking hold, and it couldn't have been the worst of times. It was the perfect storm. And those anti-free speech voices in academia saw exactly what it promised. It allowed them to move, as all countries do. There's no accident in England right now. They're doing a crackdown on free speech. And even in England, which has been one of the most hostile free speech countries in the world, what they're doing now is breathtaking. But those same voices saw the recent riots on immigration as an opportunity. And they have ramped up. They're now saying they're arresting people for extreme ideology, not conduct, not even speech, ideology. And COVID did that in the United States. And I talk about COVID in the book because it shows how dangerous censorship is. Many of those voices that were censored have been vindicated. Many of those experts who questioned the surgical mask's efficacy, who opposed the closing of schools, who argued the lab theory of COVID, they've all been vindicated. I spoke not long ago, it was last year at the University of Chicago, and in the front of the seats were all of these people that signed the Great Barrington Declaration, all these scientists from Stanford, Harvard, Columbia. They were all fired or isolated. They lost their positions on associations. And afterwards, I asked them, how many of you have been given back what was taken from you? Not one. They remained persona non grata, even though they were proven correct. Because censorship is never really about the truth. It's about controlling speech. And they didn't yield. They didn't shut up. They were unreasonable. And so there's no going back for them.
We actually have the privilege of hearing from one of the authors of the Barrington Declaration later today, at lunchtime.
There you go.
The next question is pretty broad. What do you perceive to be the greatest threat to our freedoms today, and what facets of our society are most vulnerable to the looming dangers that we see around us?
Well, it's tempting because as Chicago, and the answer to all those questions is always the Green Bay Packers, but I can't figure out how to make that work.
Most vulnerable Packers.
Yeah, but somewhere in there, the Green Bay Packers are a threat. But no, the greatest threat, it's sort of, there's two ways to answer that. One is, I think that in terms of actual systems, the greatest threat is probably the ranking systems that have been funded through the Biden administration and other sources. Some of us have been writing about these. We've been successful in shutting a couple of them down. These are systems that target the revenue of individuals and sites by ranking them as dangerous. One of them was out of England, was funded by the Biden administration, and would tell advertisers, these are the most dangerous sites. It turned out that the 10 most dangerous sites were all conservative and libertarian. Things like, and also included things like the New York Post. And the most reliable sites were sites like the Huffington Post. And some of us wrote about it, and the administration said, oh, okay, we're going to cut off funding. But it's sort of like whack-a-mole. I mean, you take out this one, and you find out there's 10 more. It's like the Disinformation Governance Board. When they shut that down, they didn't mention that they had 5 other offices doing the same thing. They just told the public, we shut down that board. And we found out with the Twitter files that there were other offices that were even larger. And so those ranking systems, which include NewsGuard, are a huge threat to free speech because they are a very sophisticated effort to choke out opposing views by cutting off their money. But the greatest threat to us is really a crisis of faith. You know, the Constitution is a leap of faith. It always has been. It's why Franklin said it's a republic if you can keep it. He knew that every system, every democratic system, even a republic, has the seeds of its own destruction. You can lose it in a blink if you just lose your faith in it. And the problem with the Constitution is it's a covenant, not between us and the government, but between us and those around us. It's between the citizens, where we say, we will fight for what you say, regardless of your viewpoints. We have trust that free speech is going to be its own correction. What we have is a rising generation of speech phobics. They have been shaped through higher education. We need to reach those people. We need to have a reawakening. Just as Goldman said, I don't need a lecture, they don't want a lecture. They don't want people to know where lines like that shank line come from. It's our job to educate them, to have that reawakening.
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing to educate, and we're trying to do some of that at the Steamboat Institute as well. Please join me in thanking Professor Turley.
Thank you very much.